Welcome to The Long Run. This is a podcast for biotech adventurers. I'm your host, Luke Timmerman. Today's guests are Daniel Levine and Dan Maher. They are the co-authors of A Rare Breed: How People and Perseverance Built BioMarin into one of the world's most innovative companies. These two made for a good tag team. Levine, the gravelly-voiced guy you'll hear from, is a veteran biotech journalist. He knows the ingredients of a good story and knows how to write clean and clear. Maher, or should I say Maher, if I get my Irish pronunciation right, spent more than a decade of his career at BioMarin Pharmaceuticals. He knew where a lot of the bodies were buried and conducted more than 100 interviews with former and current employees to uncover much more of the company history than even he knew. The legwork shows. This is a deeply researched book, but also a fast-moving, briskly paced story that doesn't get bogged down in too much unnecessary, insidery detail. I reviewed the book on Timmerman Report in October. Even though it's a corporate-sponsored effort, and these kind of things tend to be lackluster and airbrushed at best, I believe that A Rare Breed is worth reading and thinking about. It provides a revealing perspective on the rare disease drug development business, especially some of the subtler, underappreciated aspects of what makes a biotech company succeed or fail. It's worth checking out on Amazon as a gift for the biotech bibliophile in your circle. Now, quick, before diving into this conversation, I want to thank the sponsors of The Long Run. The Biotech Showcase, co-organized by EBD Group, is coming up January 8 to 10 in San Francisco. Listeners of this podcast can get a $200 discount when registering. Just type in Long Run, all one word, as the registration code when you get your pass for the Biotech Showcase. Now I want to thank the newest sponsor of the show, Presage Biosciences. This company has a micro-injector device that enables intratumoral microdosing of experimental cancer drugs. It enables researchers to evaluate several drugs at once against a single tumor. To learn more, go to presagebio.com. Last thing, Bob Moore, a veteran biotech venture capitalist at Alta Partners, joined me for the next episode of The Long Run. We talk about how the industry has evolved since he got started in the 1980s, how he approaches the job of being a biotech venture capitalist, and what areas he thinks are ripe for future investment. Now, join me and Daniel Levine and Dan Maher for The Long Run. Welcome to the Long Run podcast. Today with me, I have Danny Levine and Dan Maher. They are the co-authors of A Rare Breed, and this is a book of the corporate history of BioMarin Pharmaceuticals. So now listeners of this show know that I don't usually have two people on at once, so I think you guys will be guinea pigs in a sense. But you have different sounding voices, so that's good. We'll be able to tell who's speaking to different parts of the book. But just to get started, I thought it would be helpful for listeners who haven't read the book. I have read the book, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. I reviewed it on Timmerman Report. I don't usually read corporate history books because I find them to be kind of self-serving or coffee table books that kind of gloss over a lot of the nitty-gritty real stories of how companies came to be successful or overcame their challenges. But I think this book is different. It's special, really, in that it goes to significant lengths to chronicle the early days of BioMarin and its twists and turns along the way to becoming what it is, a diversified, successful, independent biotech company devoted to rare disease. So before we get into like what you found and the real story here, how did this project get started? Maybe Dan Maher, you could take this one.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I had decided after 35 years in biotech and 12 plus years at BioMarin that I wanted to retire. And it was about time. And so I sat down with Jean-Jacques Bien-Aimé, JJ we call him, our CEO, at the end of 15. and told him I'm going to retire, and I'm not sure when, but I just wanted to give him, an early heads up so we could figure out, what the transition should look like, all that stuff. And long story short, he asked me before I left if I would write the history of BioMarin.
Now, Dan, you at this time had about 13 years of experience, and you were at the end Senior Vice President of Corporate Development. Is that right?
Product development.
Okay.
Yeah. So running all of the different programs, and all the leaders of the teams and all that stuff, and portfolio strategy and so on.
So you had experienced a lot of the history here.
Oh yeah. I started in 2003. It was 7 years actually later than when it was founded, so I didn't have the complete history, but I paid attention to all the stuff all over the years, and I think that's why JJ figured out, quickly that if I were to, eventually leave, much of the history would leave with me, at least the stuff that I knew. So I said, yeah, I'd love to. I just didn't quite figure out how I was going to do it just yet. I said, let me come back to you next week and kind of talk to you about what I think we should do. So he put me in touch with Deborah Charlesworth, who's our VP of Corporate Communications. Said, why don't you sit down with Deborah and figure out what you want to do? So I did that.
Okay, and so how did you get going on this project? You started interviewing people, right?
I did. What I decided to do was to make it not just my story. I mean, I had spent my first 12 years at Genentech in the early days, and I read all of the history books on Amazon that referred to Genentech, and one rang true. The one that rang true was really a transcription of a interview with Bob Swanson, and his view of the first 20 years at Genentech, and that was the only one that really rang true for lots of reasons, not the least of which was, he was arguably one of the founders, if not the founder of biotechnology with Boyer. But that gave me a hint. I said, that's what I'll do, is I'll interview everyone, former and current, that I still know or know of. And then I'll also spend some time trying to hunt down all the original founders and board members, and the first CEO and the second CEO hired me, and so on and so forth. So I went off on actually a total of a 2-year journey to do the interviewing. And then Deborah introduced me to Danny.
Now, there were more than 100 people that you interviewed, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I have over 150 hours of audio. It was all transcribed, because that was the basis for which Danny and I could both speak to and decide how to, piece together the stories in the book, and so on and so forth.
Now, how did Danny, you're a veteran biotech journalist. You're on your own now. How did you come to this project?
Well, I have known Deborah Charlesworth for a while, and she called me in to sit down with her and Dan, and we talked about doing the project. And it not only intrigued me because I do a lot of work in the rare disease space, but also because there was a commitment to telling an unvarnished tale. That, as you had mentioned earlier, the intent was not to do a coffee table book, but a true history of the company.
Yeah, and this is rare. I mean, to use a bad pun, we don't get a lot of these in biotech. So I'll just share with. I'm guessing many listeners have not had a chance to get this yet. The book is still pretty new. It is available on Amazon. But there was one passage that I pulled out that I think was kind of a guiding statement of purpose. You guys wrote that few companies ever succeed in getting a drug to market. Even fewer are able to achieve that milestone again and again. One of the questions that we set out to answer in writing this book is what accounts for BioMarin's success? And in answering this question, we also wanted to see whether it pointed to ways to continue that success or allow others to replicate it. So I think a lot of people in biotech would say, wow, we'd kind of like to know that too. So tell me about what you learned. What did you find in the course of reporting out this book?
I think there were a number of things. I think, as we've discussed before, there were decisions made along the way that had great ramifications for the company being able to control its own destiny. This was both time and again with building out a great competency in manufacturing. It was something they fought with early on with their partner Genzyme when they commercialized their first drug. And I think that's really been a strength. And if you look at even the New York Times yesterday talking about the roadblocks to gene therapy and the struggle companies are having with getting viral vectors to bring new gene therapies to the market, this is something that BioMarin has addressed through building its own internal capabilities for doing this. I think the second thing is the sheer longevity as an independent company, which in part is a credit to their ability to not be just an R&D shop for bigger companies, but to really bring a product all the way from discovery to market. And then I think the third, which is the harder thing to get your arms around, is the culture. And I think that culture wasn't always there. I think it grew out of crisis, much to the credit of a team of people like Dan, who, when one CEO was ousted and things were in dire straits, they all really pulled together and found a common purpose in focusing on rare diseases. And then JJ coming along and embracing focusing on what you do well, and really creating a culture where science was valued, where people had the opportunity to contribute and feel like they had the opportunity to make contributions, and really a motivation that was much deeper than just building a successful company, but really having a very close relationship with the patient populations that they served.
Now, there's a lot to pull apart here that I think are subtle aspects of the business that don't get a lot of public attention. When you talk about manufacturing and the importance of really developing that expertise, and also the culture parts. These are just harder to evaluate on the outside. In biotech, we tend to evaluate the clinical trial data, the randomized controlled data that's presented at a medical meeting, or maybe the big business development master stroke, and those things matter a lot, but it's only part of the puzzle. And you guys, I think, do a really nice job of explaining those underappreciated and subtler aspects. But Dan, let's actually talk through some of the narrative here, how this company got established, got going. It was really this initial product, Aldurazyme for MPS 6. What happened there? Dan, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I might step back a little earlier than that, Luke, and describe
MPS 1 just to be clear.
Oh, MPS. Yeah. I'm sorry. Which one?
MPS 1.
Oh, I'm sorry. I mixed that up. Okay.
Yeah, no worries. But the real genesis of BioMarin was a smaller company called Glyco, and that was founded by several people. But the one I want to call out is Gwyn Williams. Gwyn is a serial entrepreneur. He was a founder of Zoma, the fourth biotech company ever. And he's a trained physicist. He was head of tax at Arthur Young. He just has a pedigree that is absolutely amazing. He actually was co-inventor with John Clock, who was the first CMO of BioMarin for the quick AIDS test, which is still in use today in Africa. So there's really a wonderful scientific legacy of our founders there. And Gwen's idea was to form a company that could measure carbohydrates, because he had read several papers and worked with a scientist at Oxford and became very intrigued with the implications of the fine study of carbohydrate chemistries. That led to Glycomed, which he also founded, where John Klock also worked. Long story short, they started a small company measuring carbohydrate chemistries in Novato, right around the corner from what would be the first building for BioMarin, the so-called Pink Palace. And what all of that led to was the realization that they needed to extend from measuring carbohydrates into therapeutic areas related to carbohydrate chemistry. So that was the basis of the science. They did a long search and found a paper in PNAS in '94 where Emil Kakis, a physician researcher at UCLA Harbor, along with Liz Neufeld, characterized the MPS I disorder and the enzyme and the carbohydrate chemistry that characterized the disease. And then they published in that paper initial dog study results. Gwen found that paper. They arranged meetings quickly, John Klock and Chris Starr, with Emil and Liz. And then eventually that led to a partnership. And Emil came on board at BioMarin shortly thereafter. And that led to the first product opportunity ever in therapeutics. And by this time, BioMarin had been purchased by Glyco, and later that the tide was turned. But that was really the whole story of the genesis of the first product.
So this would have been the late 1990s. Biotech is beginning to be on the upswing. The Human Genome Project was in the news. The stock market was doing pretty well. And at the time, I mean, Genzyme had some success with rare disease enzyme replacement therapy. So you could make these things recombinantly if you had a single gene disorder for certain rare diseases. So I mean, this looked like something possible to the entrepreneurs, to the investors, right?
Exactly correct. And it was very important to Gwen and Grant Dennison, who was then now the first CEO, and John Klock, to seek out a partner. And of course, the first logical partner was Genzyme. And truth be told, Genzyme actually turned down various approaches to them multiple times before finally John and Chris Starr and Grant Dennison came upon an idea, which was to video small numbers of patients in the very first clinical trial that I'll call it a phase 1/2, where patients were being treated. And over a 6-month period, you could see various improvements in endurance and mobility and range of motion. You know, the very standard things that back then were not so standard were sort of the new ideas on how to approach these very, very complex single gene diseases. And long story short, they took that video to Genzyme finally, and Henry Tamir and his team saw it, and Henry said, "Okay, we're going to do this. Let's go to work." And so that led to a deal, and to this day, those that know of the story call it the $30 million video, because that's what actually made the deal happen. And it also allowed BioMarin to have a credible, larger partner and then proceed to go public, which was the IPO.
Yeah, and I love how you bring in some of these telling details of the story, like the $30 million video or the Pink Palace. Another one that I enjoyed was the Quonset hut that was set up. For those unfamiliar, these were kind of primitive World War II style simple huts that Emil Kakis and his team at UCLA somehow obtained one of these on a shoestring budget so they could make small quantities of what became Aldurazyme for clinical trials. It's sort of like a classic, scrappy startup story in some parts.
Exactly.
Yeah. So now this is also where patients enter the story. You guys found a boy named Ryan Dant, I believe was his name. His dad became a very avid patient advocate, flying around the world, meeting researchers, coming into contact with Emil Kakis and colleagues. What did you learn about really the fundamentals of the business and how sort of the die was cast for BioMarin to become a rare disease company in those days?
I think what was really important getting to not only the patient piece, but establishing the culture at BioMarin, which we alluded to earlier, was the extreme significance of what I loosely call personalized medicine. It was very personal to everyone at the early days of BioMarin, and I'll say still to this day, that you personalize the work that you do because it'll lead to helping treat patients. And back then, Mark Dant, Ryan's dad, and mom, Jean, the very first thing they did was when they had their son diagnosed, and remember, this was back in the early 90s, was to try and figure out what are we going to do. And they couldn't find anyone interested in treating the disease. Ultimately, they heard of Liz Neufeld and Emil Kakis at one of the scientific medical meetings they had funded themselves to go to learn more about the disease. And that led to a relationship between Mark and Jean and Ryan and Emil. And Emil was very, very important to the first 10 years of BioMarin. It was he who, both as a physician and a scientist, made the original idea happen for loranodase or Aldurazyme. And he's a passionate physician scientist. And it was all about figuring out how to make enough enzyme both to study first in dogs and then to treat initial patients. And there was nothing in the world that was going to stop this man from getting that done. And his partner was the Dant family, and they did a bake sale to raise the initial funding for Emil in his lab, and just to buy some basic materials. So that spawned then, the BioMarin passion and focus on getting to what's important first, cutting away all the extraneous BS, and just figuring out how to get something done. And a lot of that's due to Emil and his passion for patients.
Biotech Showcase is coming up January 8 to 10 in San Francisco's Union Square. Listeners of this show are welcome to take a $200 discount off registration. Just type in Long Run, all one word, as the registration code when you're checking out. Thanks to EBD Group for sponsoring the Long Run. And have you heard of Presage Biosciences? This company has a micro-injector device that enables intratumoral microdosing of experimental cancer drugs. This enables researchers to evaluate several drugs at once against a single tumor. It's in clinical trials now. To learn more, go to presagebio.com. How much money did it take to get across that finish line, to really get that that drug in the vial?
The drug in the vial and approved about $110 million is the number I recall. So in terms of today's dollars...
There's one point I just don't want to gloss over. If you go back to Mark Dent, because it's such an important point in the rare disease space. You've got a father who is essentially a cop, not in the science world. And he's got what he thinks is a healthy 3-year-old that he suddenly finds out has this horrendous genetic disease. And he's told the kid is going to die by the time he's 10 or at most 12. So he's racing against the clock. And as he goes out into this world of drug discovery and drug development, he finds out it's going to take 10 to 15 years to get a drug into the marketplace. And this is a reality that rare disease patients face every day, that their diseases often progress far faster than science and far faster than the regulatory world. And, one of the great successes of BioMarin has really been the speed at which it has been able to move drugs through that process, particularly in the development phase, where on average it's something like 5 years. Is that right, Dan? I mean, it is one of the fastest companies. It is one of the fastest companies at moving drugs through the clinic to approval.
And part of that is attributable to the fact that this was personal. Like with a small indication such as this, you actually get to know some of the patients. And it's no longer, an academic curiosity, to get another paper on your CV or even that next round of funding. The next round of funding or going IPO, those are steps along the way. But this company developed that kind of laser focus on getting that drug across the FDA finish line.
There's a story in there with Chuck O'Neill, I think, who's the VP of Pharmaceutical Sciences, where I think it was after Vimizim was approved, Paul Harmitz, who was the principal investigator, had brought over some patients for a celebration they were having at the company. And, at the time, O'Neill had said he expected to be at BioMarin for 3 or 4 years. And he was introduced to one of the patients, this little girl, who took his hand and wouldn't let go and thanked him for creating this drug. Excuse me. And
Chuck is
the impact that has on
there today.
Yeah,
I mean, he has never left the company, and that experience still stays with him.
Well, it's a powerful, motivating experience when you meet a young boy or girl with a fatal disease that's in progressive decline, and you realize, gee, if we can run through the clinical trials with this enzyme replacement, we can make a difference for them. I mean, that's the kind of thing that gets people to stay late, come in on the weekend if they have to. It's a strong sense of purpose. But now, BioMarin didn't always have such a clear direction or sense of purpose. It wandered at times and had, I think, more than one near-death experience. How can you... Maybe, Dan, you want to take that one in terms of what happened after, say, the first few years and that initial taste of success with Aldurazyme?
Right. Once Aldurazyme was off and running, the relationship was tenuous at best because Genzyme was the bigger company, BioMarin the smaller company, and lots of tensions, lots of issues. I oversaw that from the day one and when I got there. But the CEO at the time, Fred Price, was the second CEO after Grant Dennison left the company. And Fred was a tough individual.
Let's back up real quick on Grant Dennison. So he was the CEO for the first few years,
Sure.
Late 90s through early 2000s. And what happened under his leadership?
Well, Grant was a CEO and absentee, quite frankly. Very, very smart individual, pedigree in big pharma, Pfizer specifically, and Grant had a drinking problem, And so in reality, Grant wasn't around all that much, but his CFO, William Anderson, was the de facto go-to guy if anybody had questions or wanted to talk about a particular strategy, so on and so forth. And Bill Anderson had the tacit approval of Grant to sort of be his eyes and ears.
Is this Bill Anderson now at Genentech?
No, a different Bill Anderson.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But, it's worth noting that there was a lot of tension between senior management, particularly between two people that kind of had overlapping responsibilities for drug development. And that tension often had the company working at cross purposes.
Well, there were there was a leadership vacuum in some respect, and that created competing factions, right?
Exactly. And Grant had brought Fred Price in as a consultant because with the Aldurazyme Genzyme story, one of the key areas of tensions was Genzyme wanted to take over manufacturing, and we wouldn't let them. And it was a big fight, and Grant had worn out his goodwill with Henry over the matter, and he couldn't really negotiate or be positive with Genzyme, nor would Genzyme be positive with him. So he brought Fred in to sort of arbitrate the negotiations or the dilemma that we found ourselves in. And so that's how Fred got exposed to BioMarin and its story. And Fred was also at Pfizer. They worked together, as I think I mentioned. And that led, once Grant was fired because of his personal problem, it led to an opening for Fred, and the board asked him to be the next CEO. And there's several stories in the book that relate to that. But Fred came in and got rid of the vacuum. I mean, there was no question that Fred was in charge, large and in charge, and that also squared away. He's a big guy, very intimidating, led to an intimidating physical presence and intellectual presence. He is a strong leader, and it was an eye-opening experience, I'll say, for BioMarin to now have Fred on board and helping us or directing us or telling us what to do. And so that was a whole new breath of ammonia salts, I'll say. And for Fred, to his credit, it did transform the business, raised a lot of money, focused the company. But that led, as you asked about, Luke, to a couple of almost near-death experiences. The first of which was Orapred, where Fred was hell-bent to purchase a sales force because Naglazyme was in our near future, the second MPS disorder for MPS 6 that we wanted to treat, and we needed a U.S. field force. And he also needed cash flow, and so we bought a franchise from a company called Medicis. And Orapred was an oral prednisolone sulfate, grape-flavored asthma medicine for children. And a 72-person sales force came with it. Long story short, the product went generic within months after almost using up all of our cash to purchase the franchise. And the bottom fell out on pricing, as you would expect. And that led then, with a couple other issues, to some very, very serious introspection on whether or not we could survive. It was very bad.
There were some accounting issues going on there with Orapred, like maybe some inventory stuffing of some kind that made it look like it was selling a little better or had a better trajectory than it actually had. But it's also a fundamentally different kind of product than the ones that you're talking about with Aldurazyme, Naglazyme. I mean, these were kind of treatments that did not exist. There were no alternatives, and these were life-altering, potentially, therapies. Whereas, a grape-flavored cough medicine for asthma, that's more of a mass market type indication, more of an incremental sort of benefit. How did that fit into the culture that was already pretty well established a few years in?
Well, it didn't fit into the culture, but the thing about Fred was he was never embracing the rare disease business model. That his marching order to his team was time and again to go out and find him blockbusters and to bring those into the company. So while they were doing the Orapred deal, they had also purchased a molecule that they thought had potential for being a very large indication for cardiovascular surgeries.
This is part of the.
And that was a product called.
Well, go ahead, Dan.
No, I was going to say that was another example of an Orapred-like product, which was, something that was out of our wheelhouse, something that we didn't do, and frankly weren't experienced enough to do it well. And those were some near-death blows that really almost ensured that there would be no BioMarin ever. And part of the neat story in the book is sort of weaving the thread of how we managed to live and fight another day there. But between those two products, I'll say, Luke, and what happened there, Neutralace was killed over a weekend because of a data safety monitoring board meeting in Chicago where it was called a futile. In other words, it would never show a statistically significant difference between the arms, and Fred killed it. Ironically, Emil was not part of the decision, nor Chris Starr, who were both the scientific leaders under Fred at the time at the company. Stu Sweedler understood all the ramifications. He was the head of clinical, and Fred killed it on the weekend. I remember Emil calling me up at midnight on a Saturday night and said, well, the product that you're starting a whole new team up for and that we're ready to ramp up and complete phase 3 trials and spend a lot more money, well, we just killed it. What I want you to do on Monday morning is to take the whole team aside, tell them what happened, then we'll tell the whole company right after that, and I want you to do a new product. It's called Phenoptin. It's the one that's in license that Dan Oppenheimer and I just worked through, and that eventually led to a product called Kuvan, by the way.
That hurts. I mean, that's kind of a gut punch you just took there, and there's not a lot of time to dwell on it. You've got to turn the page quickly.
Exactly.
Cash was running low at this point, right?
On it, oh yeah, big time. And then Fred was let go by the board. Lots of drama and everything, but long story short, he was let go. And there was this 9-month void of leadership yet again. And that's what I think Danny referred to earlier was, what do we do now? I think the long story short and the lesson that I'll put forth was this allowed us to reset and get back to what we knew how to do, which was to study, develop, make enzymes for ultra-rare diseases in the MPS space. And we got back to that. And we got back to a few other things, like I mentioned, Kuvan and so forth. So this was an opportunity to reset. And, it was difficult with the first two CEOs. We almost didn't survive for various reasons, as I described. But this 9-month walk in the desert allowed us, thankfully, to set a new course, which was back to what we knew how to do.
Well, I think this experience throws into sharp relief the kind of the fundamentally different business models at work. I mean, there is the rare disease business model, which is, by definition, it's low volume, high impact. Well, it better be high impact for the small number of patients you address. Or you can go in a large volume kind of business, a more primary care, mass market type of indication. Sometimes those can be high impact as well, but not always. There can be some Me Tooism there. And you kind of have to choose what kind of company you are, and then organize yourself accordingly. So that's what happened here after Fred Price left, right?
Exactly.
So when does JJ Bienaimé enter the picture?
Well, JJ came on board after Fred, but there was that 9-month gap. So when JJ came on board, it was right before Naglazyme. I think it was the week Naglazyme got approved. He walked into having to make a go-no-go on a partnership deal for $25 million, which he didn't have a lot of time or choice on because the company needed the money. And he also came up to a decision on how the company was going to address the global sales for that drug. They had been in late-stage negotiations with Genzyme over a partnership. It was Naglazyme was for MPS 6, which is a market that was believed to be about half as big as MPS 1, and Genzyme knew that BioMarin was not in much of a negotiating point, and was really shoving a deal down their throat that no one wanted. And I think one of the early things that JJ did that really shaped what this company is today was make the decision to go it alone and build their own global sales force.
And how much money did you have? Did BioMarin have at that point?
Well, before they did the deal with Merck Serono, which gave them $25 million, they were down to probably less than 2 months cash. Is that right, Dan?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we were on the verge of not being able to pass an outside audit as a going concern.
And then, okay, you get a lifeline here, a bit of a runway with $25 million from a partner, and then a gutsy decision is made to walk away from a partnership with Genzyme because the terms just aren't satisfactory. Essentially, you're not bargaining from a position of strength, so you'll just have to walk away and figure out how to do it yourself.
Exactly, and that was a very interesting time. I mean, I was still the executive in charge of the relationship with Genzyme. I'll never forget the day where it was due to be our final negotiation session. Genzyme came out to us. Even their president of the business, David Meeker, who I believe is still very much a key part of running Genzyme Sanofi.
He's actually left recently.
Yeah.
Oh, has he? Okay, yeah. He's been there a long, long time.
Yeah.
And what happened was, interestingly, Genzyme was still, playing games with us. They didn't send us their latest red line version of the agreement draft. Like you usually do customarily with potential partners. You send it to them a day or two in advance so they can read it. Then you show up and you negotiate and you see where you are. They didn't even send it to us. They basically provided it to us when they arrived. And we just reviewed the key back and forth red line items. And it was really a deal terms set that was terrible and took advantage of us. It was something on the basis of our relationship with Aldurazyme that we really, really knew it would be bad if we went ahead. And we went in and we sat down with JJ, leaving Genzyme in the room, and gave him the news, and we said, this is as good as it's going to get. And it was pretty bad. And he said, okay, go tell them no. And we'll figure out what to do. And we walked back in the room and told him that the deal negotiations are over. We're not going to go forward. Thank you for coming. And I'll never forget the looks on their face. They were quite surprised because they figured they had us over a barrel because we had no infrastructure at all outside the U.S. and very little in the U.S. even. So JJ's, I told JJ this, and I tell everybody when they want to know, that was maybe one of the top handful of decisions that allowed BioMarin to be here today was JJ saying, okay, we're going to do this on our own. And
that had the effect of being quite a clarifying directive, right? Because at that point, now you've got so much cash in the bank, you've got enough time to execute, to go all in on manufacturing, sales and marketing, whatever you've got to do to make that next product. It was Naglazyme, right? You had to make that thing. You had whole ownership of it, and it was do or die.
Pretty much. And in hindsight, looking back, it allowed us to build our worldwide infrastructure and to rival anyone, frankly, in the rare disease space. And then the other products approved since Vimizim comes to mind. It was basically plug and play. We had the relationships, the regulatory relationships, the quality relationships, the physician relationships, the infrastructure for commercial supply and delivery. It all was there, and it really made the new products in our future an even faster commercial launch uptake than was Naglazyme, which was frankly very, very slow because we had to start from scratch.
And in that case, with those subsequent products, you would no longer be in a position of being at the mercy of a Genzyme, where somebody could put you over a barrel. That really couldn't happen because you had all those things that you just mentioned in place already. You could do a deal on your own terms if you wanted to.
Correct.
So you guys, I know JJ got behind this project early on, and I haven't asked him. I'm guessing you have. What he hoped to accomplish with commissioning this book. You wanted to, I think, sort of codify the culture, sort of pass down some of those lessons, of what worked and what didn't, so that hopefully people can learn from them and make wise decisions in the future. Also, it's a big company now, so not everybody knows how BioMarin came to be. What kind of feedback have you gotten from various people who've had a chance to read it at this point, whether they're old timers or some of the new employees?
Luke, just to emphasize a point there, one of the things that I think biotechs often face is becoming victims of their own success. And if you look at the growth of BioMarin and the number of products that have ramped up in recent years, they now have more than half their staff that's been there less than 3 years, which is kind of astounding to think about. So I think one of the things in telling the story is to really make people who are new to the company feel a part of this history and tradition that they've established. But BioMarin's, I think, fairly unusual also in not kind of wearing its culture on its sleeve. And Dan, maybe you can speak to this, but there's a very intentional effort not to, kind of put the mission statement on your forehead.
Right.
Come back to that. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah. No, I was going to say that that's very, very true. Maybe that came from Fred Price. A little story that is not in the book, but is in the film that complements the book is Fred basically wanted to have a mission statement established way back under his tenure, and he basically took the Pfizer mission statement and value statement and put BioMarin's name on the top, handed it out to the executives and said, I want this to be our new mission statement. And Robert Boffey, who's an executive vice president still to this day, one of the longest tenured employees of BioMarin, he called Fred out and suffered for it. But I think that really helped establish the fact that we don't want to write any of this down. We'd rather just live it and lead by example and so on and so forth. And Luke, to your question, what are the things that I've learned and what are some of the feedback? I mean, one of the interesting things when I set off on all my interviews with, especially with current longtime employees, I always asked them at the end, I said, why are you still here? I really wanted to know, because many of them have been here 16, 17, 18, 19 years, almost the full 20. And what I expected was a reference to, our passion for patience, because that's an overused term and many, many companies, so on and so forth. We really do live it, I believe. And I expected employees to say that first. And amazingly to me, which was a key learning, and perhaps speaks to the unique nature of our culture, was that was not the first answer. They all said in one form or another, I'm still here because of the people, because I don't want to let them down. And of course, they don't want to let them down in the context of drug development and getting medicines to patients. That was revealing to me.
Your colleagues, your coworkers, the people in your department or people at your level in other departments that you work with that you see every day. It's not always the CEO either, even though they do set culture and direction, and that's very important. But it's it's that harder thing that more intangible thing it's hard to put your finger on, that culture, that way of working. And if your direct boss or is a bad guy or a jerk, I mean, it's it's very easy to just walk out the door and find another job.
Well, many of the long-term employees and scientists lived through the Fred era, and several executives as well. But it really spoke to that, despite problems at the top in the past, they all came to work for each other. It's like the analogy of a Super Bowl team or NBA champion. Any sense of true team that you want to offer up, and there are many examples. That really, really is an important aspect. And you can't, in my experience, you can't really snap your fingers and say, okay, you're a team. You have to become one. And that's one of the secrets. I know it's maybe disappointing to people who really want to know a secret and say, oh, that's no secret. But maybe the secret is actually making it happen.
Yeah. And now, Danny, I want to come back to something you said earlier about the biotech companies often becoming a victim of their own success as they grow and mature. What were you thinking? What some examples, maybe?
Well, you can start. You can start with Genentech, I think, where it's still a very successful company, but I think it's qualitatively very different a place than it was when folks like Dan were there, and it was a much smaller biotech. I think that's true for any of the large biotechs. It's very hard to preserve a culture. I think of a story where in the early, Genentech was famous for having their ho-hos, their kind of Friday beer gatherings, and someone, a senior scientist there, told me a story about going up and introducing herself to a guy she didn't recognize. It turned out to be Art Levinson, who was the CEO. That kind of tells you how, people begin to become a little anonymous in large organizations. And I think with that, you get a dissipation on the sense of mission that once drove everyone.
And by its very nature, a company like BioMarin, it's been around 20 years now. That's something that requires constant vigilance. You don't want it to decay. You don't want to lose it.
It's not only that it requires constant vigilance, but you now have something that is geographically dispersed with a presence in many different countries. And how do those people all align with the vision that is driving the folks back home?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Hence, I think JJ's ultimate wisdom with wanting the history captured in a book, and as I mentioned, we even have a film that goes with it. So, what better way to share that geographic dispersion and most of the company are newer employees, don't really understand where we came from, so that they can help make it a better future for all. So that kind of, I think, Luke, is the wisdom in both the book and the film, and hopefully it works, because we're getting well within shooting distance of being the size of the Genentechs and the Genzymes and the other biotech companies that struggle with growing.
Yeah, I mean, BioMarin's got, I forget, is it 5 products on the market and market value of well over $10 billion.
Well, 6 with Bernura.
Yeah, it's closer to 6 and 14, something like that.
Firdapse in Europe, and then you've got 2 products that are very close to entering the market behind that. But with that becomes another challenge, which is that the types of products that BioMarin can now develop and bring to the market by the nature of the company need to be larger than the ones they built themselves on. And that becomes another challenge, particularly in the rare disease space.
The law of large numbers kicks in.
Yeah.
And then you have, with a small patient population, you've got pricing pressures, which was something that you guys didn't really cover in the book. And I can understand there's a lot, you have to decide what to include and what not to include. And maybe someone else wants to take on that question of what fair pricing looks like with rare diseases. But have you guys heard much feedback from outside the company yet? Or I want to come back to this. Like, what kinds of what have people had to say about your work so far?
I've spoken.
Well, I'll go ahead, Dan. Yeah, I'll.
No, I think the feedback I've gotten, and frankly, they've been from a number of people who are not really industry rooted, was they were surprised that it had such a strong narrative to it. I think from folks in the industry, the feedback I've gotten is that they feel like they really did get a kind of behind the scenes glimpse at how a biotech company is built.
Yeah, and I do think that's a valuable service and something that is too seldom done. The industry, it's always looking toward the future, and it doesn't do a great job of recording the past. And I think there are lessons to learn there that people can apply in their day-to-day lives. So it's a book that I recommend, and I really salute you guys for taking on this project. I know it was it probably felt like a labor of love. How much time did this really take you to put together?
A couple of years, all in.
And how many rewrites on the manuscript?
Fortunately, I write clean, don't I, Dan? It was, I became involved in the project in March of 2016, and we went to press in July of 2017, so something like that.
Well, it is available, as I said, on Amazon, and Christmas is coming, so I would recommend this for the biotech person in your family, or even curious non-scientists. I think the book is written in an accessible form for people who actually want to understand some of the nitty-gritty of the pharmaceutical business, what it's about. I think you guys have done a good service. So thank you very much for being with me here on the Long Run Podcast.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Long Run, a production of Timmerman Report. Pedro Rosado of Headstepper Media was the producer and editor. Music comes from D.A. Wallach. Thanks to EBD Group and Presage Biosciences for sponsoring The Long Run. Next episode, Bob Moore, a veteran biotech venture capitalist at Alta Partners, join me for the next episode of The Long Run. We talk about how the industry has evolved since he started in the industry in the 1980s, how he approaches the job of being a biotech VC, and what areas he thinks are ripe for future investment. Don't miss this upcoming episode of The Long Run.